Okay, hi. Thanks for staying for this. This is Gavin Schmidt.
Hi, how are you?
He can probably explain what he does better than me, so I'll let him do it. You want to tell me what you do?
Okay, so I'm a climate scientist. I'm not as old as Wally Broker, nor as famous. What I do is I put together models for how the world works. You know, different components that are going on. You know, what happens in the ocean, what happens in the atmosphere, the clouds and the ice, and how that all interacts. And we use those kind of modeled worlds to kind of poke and prod the real and try and understand how the real world would react. Because you need to have a laboratory. You need to have something you can test. Because the real world, we only got one of those, and right now we're doing one experiment. And what we would like to know is how that experiment is going to turn out before it actually happens. Right? That's the whole point of our science. So that's about it, really.
So what's going to happen?
Well, so I don't think we're going to be reduced to a few breeding pairs, living off the land in a couple of 100 years. I think things are more optimistic than that for many of the reasons that I think you brought up in this piece, which is that there is a maturity to a civilization, right? Before we knew what we were doing with ozone-depleting chemicals, it didn't matter how many spray cans we used or how many fridges we filled with Freon. But once you know what the effect is, once you know that you're going to bring something crashing down on your head, which is a great metaphor, by the way, you think, oh, yeah, maybe I shouldn't do that. And we didn't. And with CFCs and aerosol cans and things, we stopped doing that. And the ozone layer didn't collapse to the point where it could have done, and is actually on its way to being mended. Now, climate change is a bigger issue. Climate change is more complicated. There are more things that are going on. There are more things that we're doing, and it's by more people. Right? It's a much bigger issue. But we've reached that same level of understanding. We know what it is that we're doing that is doing this. We know that is continuing to get worse. We can measure it every year, and we can predict pretty much the trajectory that's going to occur. And so we can see things starting to fall on our head, but it isn't inevitable that everything is going to come crashing down. I mean, we're not going to be able to stop what's going on, but we do have a choice as to whether we let it just go on out of control, or we try really hard to make it something that changes slow enough that we can adapt to. That we can walk away from the coast instead of having to run.
Do you feel like any of the science is like misrepresented in this piece, or that like you said, it's probably like that vision of the future is obviously really outlandish, right? And it's kind of intentionally so. But I'm just curious, like, what was it like as somebody who studies the science of this, to watch a show where like things are kind of misrepresented some of the time?
You're not asking the right question to a scientist. So first off, scientists have the artistic sensibility of a gnat, right? So,
I don't know about that. I don't know about that. I wouldn't say
you should see the posters on my wall. It's not good. So, what I see when I work with artists, or I go and see shows that are touching on this theme, is really I'm looking for the stuff that isn't the science, right? I mean, I can get the science. I can read papers. I can write books. I have written a book. But what I'm looking for is something else. And what I'm looking for is a way of talking to people through narrative, through metaphor, that actually gets something across to people, that all the dry facts and figures and graphs and presentations and animations and headlines and sound bites, and that just can't do it, right? And what I find with your stuff And the main analogy that you're using, you know, like the alcoholism, the addiction, and then the coming around to seeing that there's a better way forward, is that people understand that much better than they understand radiative transfer. They understand that much better than, you know, infrared radiation coming up through the atmosphere and being absorbed by the CO2 molecules, which kind of vibrate in weird ways and then come back down and go back up. You know, that's fun, and I can, you know, anybody who actually wants to know about any of those details, feel free to ask or come up to me afterwards. But you know, metaphor is how we tell stories. Stories are why we do things. The narrative that we have in our head, the why we get up in the morning, it's a story. It's not a fact and a figure. And that's what the artists are here trying to do. And I think that you've done a great job with that. But I have one complaint. I think your metaphor works fine. And the reason is, and I think you alluded to it towards the end, is that there's a timescale issue, right? So what we're doing now, we haven't what we're doing to the planet now, we haven't caught up with what we've done, you know, 10, 20 years ago. So we're still catching up. So things are still changing. Even if they stayed the same, they would still change. And the issue with addiction is very much an issue of short-term versus long-term.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yes, that's
right.
Yep, absolutely.
And when you're there and you desperately want that cup of coffee or something else,
yeah, or cocaine,
then that's the only thing that matters, right? And it doesn't matter what anything else. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the cost is later on. You're not thinking about the later on. It's all in the here and the now. And our economy, our politics, the stories that we tell ourselves on the daily news, it's all in the here and the now. It's what's happening now. And one of the big problems that we have with this issue, is that the news about this issue is nowhere. Because news is what's new, right? If something is getting progressively worse year after year after year after year, at what point is it new? It's never new. It's just the same as it was 10 minutes ago, only a little bit worse. Just the same as it was last year, only a little bit worse, right? At what point does somebody in an editor's desk say, well, now it's different, now it's new? Well, no, it's the same as it was. And it's that difference in perspective, like the focus that we have on the here and the now, on the Twitter feed, on the Google News headlines, compared to what it is that we need to know about what we're building in for the next 5, 10, 20, 30, 100 years' time. That's the dichotomy, and that's exactly what you have when you have an addiction. It's that inability to see the future. And it's only by looking to the future that you can come out of the present. And I think that's a really important lesson that your show has and your metaphor has, that is directly applicable to this particular issue.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. Maybe we should take a question since there is one. Sure.
Cynthia, I have a question for you. First of all, I want to thank you for a very elaborate, beautiful production. Very complex, I must say. Just to do such production is a huge achievement by itself. As a producer, I can tell. I can absolutely appreciate it. And I have a question for you as an artist. I saw a huge tension here between, I would say, the factual part and the artistic part. And how did you try to connect the bridge because these two? Because the tension is there, and sometimes the art is with the upper hand, and sometimes it's more the lecture with the upper hand. How did you try to make the balance?
You know, it's like a roller coaster ride of like grueling, almost like self-torment, and then moments of wild inspiration that are really exhilarating. And then you're like, oh, what I just wrote, people are going to be upset because, like the future was just like I'm like Iris, I get possessed by these people and I don't understand. The Native American ghost it was like somebody else's hand was writing it. And so then I wrote it and I thought, well, this is going to piss some people off probably. And, but then my process is like, then I look at it again and I'm like, oh, I really like this. And it's like somebody else wrote it and I'm like, oh, I like it. And this is the first piece that I've ever really had that tension in terms of I don't want to I'm very wary of misrepresenting what's happening because I think it's really crucial for people to understand what's happening. And I'm not a scientist and I'm not a journalist or a politician. I'm an artist, so ultimately what I'm serving is the work at the end of the day. I think there was a lot of tension in the process. And I have moments of extreme doubt, and then I have moments of, well, fuck it. And then just kind of hope, that, I kept thinking, what is really the intention here? And, for me, really, the intention is almost like an homage to the natural world. And that, what I get from my, lay person's reading about science, which I love to read about science, especially the history of the world and the history of the universe. And what I get from that is complete awe, that we're here at all. And a real visceral appreciation of how miraculous it is that we live on a planet that's pretty easy to live on. It's really easy to live on, actually. There's tons of stuff growing that we can eat. It's delicious. Think about oranges. They just grow. They taste great. You don't have to add anything to them. They're amazing. They're juicy.
Actually, it's 10,000 years of farming to get you that perfect orange. But please continue.
Well, they're amazing. So that's what I hope. That's what I hope. And I think that's hard to appreciate sometimes because we get caught up in oh my God, I can't pay my rent, And so what I was hoping is to provide sort of more and that's why the alien comes, because he has a bird's eye view, he doesn't say it in this version, but at some point he said, I have a life that's more like the lifespan of a star, so I can see the bigger, picture, which we can't see. So that's what I kind of mostly hope to provide, which, yeah.
I would see these kinds of things. That you're not going to come to a show to learn about the science details, right? You didn't go and see proof with, what was her name, Mary Louise Park?
I don't know.
Yeah, Mary Louise Park. You didn't do that to actually learn about the mathematical number theory thing that she was actually supposed to be working on, right? But you went to get a sense of what it's like to be in that position, the joy of discovery and the difficulty of getting recognition for an intellectual impact. That was a very successful kind of art and science thing. Copenhagen was another very successful art and science thing. But did you learn anything really about quantum mechanics?
More than I knew.
Well, exactly. But which is, I don't want to prejudge what it is that you knew. But these things are starting off points. They're jumping off points to issues that you might not have thought of as being important or relevant. You think, well, actually, that's an interesting point. Well, what would happen? What is going to happen in a million years' time? What are they going to see of our civilization? What are the traces that we're going to leave? Those are interesting things to think about. How have we come this far? How do we deal with these things, these kinds of things as a society? And art and the narrative and the stories should be kind of setting off those conversations. And I, even if all the science was wrong, which it wasn't, The Day After Tomorrow springs to mind as another example of, well, no, the prime example of how not to mix science and storytelling. Even if it's all wrong, it still generates a conversation, right? It still sparks an interest. It still, gets people to think about something that they wouldn't have otherwise thought about. And I think that's how these things should be measured, not in whether, somebody said, 2 times instead of 4 times, or they said, CO squared instead of CO2,
Anybody want to ask a question?
Well, actually, I thought it was so interesting, Cynthia, when you started talking about Cape Farewell, and the fact that when those people put that journey together, that they did mix their group. They had scientists and artists. And what are they trying, what is Cape Farewell trying to get out of this? Are they continuing, to mix up, groups of people who are, thinkers and visionaries, the idea that there are solutions, or?
Yeah, Cape Farewell was started by an artist, a photographer named David Buckland, who had a chance, he became interested in the way the poles are changing, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but the poles are changing really fast. And they're changing fast, they continue to change faster than predicted, isn't that right?
Particularly the Arctic, the sea ice that kind of floats on the North Pole. We've lost almost half of that in the last 30 years during the summertime. So to give you a sense of that, Roald Amundsen was the Norwegian who was the first person to make the Northwest Passage, who went from Alaska through the Arctic to Nova Scotia. And that took him 3 years in a small boat. He had to overwinter for 2 years because, it would unfreeze a little bit, he'd make it, but then he got stuck and he had to stay there another winter. So that took him 3 years. This last summer, people sailed that same journey in about 3 weeks in a normal sailboat, in a sailboat like the one you were on, right? So the changes that are going on in the Arctic are really, nobody is arguing about whether that is happening or not. Those are really very dramatic changes.
Yeah. So he just wanted other people to be able to see that and maybe be inspired to make things that might inspire people, like Gavin was just saying, might inspire people to then learn more about what's happening on their own. And one of the one speech, the Wallace Broker speech I mentioned in the show was one thing that made me want to make this piece, and the other speech I heard that made me want to make it was by Jeffrey Sachs, who's writes about sustainability, and he talked about communication about climate change, and somebody in the audience who was an artist said, "What can an artist possibly do?" And he said, "Well, you can be like a translator and communicate in a different way than a journalist or a scientist can, and you can communicate to different, parts of the psyche."
Yes, the heart, not necessarily the head. Yes.
Right, and the heart, we act a lot from our hearts, for better or for worse. So, Carly, are you keeping track of the time? Excellent. Does anyone else have questions?
Any thoughts on how to keep this in the mass media as a news thing or an entertainment? I love the theater I've seen on this issue, like, fracking. It'll be in the news for a week, people will get upset, and then unless Matt Damon makes a movie, it's just a fact of life. Any thoughts on a good productive way to keep it in the mass media, the Daily News, the Post is a news item, or Hollywood?
So I'm going to use another metaphor, right? So there's this difference between weather, right? What's happening every day, up and down, raining, cold, warm, and then the climate, which is like the kind of long-term changes, the statistics. There's the same thing in news, right? There's the 24-hour news cycle. What happened? Bing, bang. They're up, they're down. Who's hot? Who's not? And then there are issues which kind of go away and then come back and then go away and then come back and then go away and then come back. And the climate of news about climate is like that, right? You won't talk about it for a while, and it will come back and it will be more important. You won't talk about it for a while and it will come back. This is one of those stories that is going to keep coming back because it isn't done. It isn't an environmental cause du jour. It isn't some fad that only the hippies care about. It's a real thing. And every time people look away and then they look back, they can actually see that something's changed. It's only when you're staring at it really, really closely you can't see it change. But then you look at a photograph of a glacier taken in 1910, and then you go to that same spot where that photograph was taken, and you look at it now in 2012, and it's disappeared. And you can go many, many places. You can go to the Himalayas, you can go to the Alps, you can go to the Andes, you can go to Papua New Guinea. Who knew there were mountain glaciers in Papua New Guinea? Well, there aren't very many anymore, but there's still a few left. You can go to Kilimanjaro, and you can see these things change, and sometimes you see them more clearly if you're not looking at them all the time. And the same thing is happening with climate. And so perhaps it isn't what we need is to have it in the news every single day, but when it does become an issue, it has to be a bigger issue, and then next time it's an issue, it has to be a bigger issue again. And I think that's happening. Sometimes I'm a little disappointed and pessimistic, and other times I'm kind of optimistic. But
I'm less concerned about the daily news cycle than I am about how one influences powers that be, who know about the truth of this, but have vested interests. So how can you be so optimistic in the face of that? I'd love to know.
Well, because we all have vested interests, right? You know, we all live in the society, and we use energy from the same sources, and you know, and our clothes are all made in China, and we all have vested interests, and yet individually we can do things, and yet there are also politicians who get it, right? There are some who kind of willfully don't, but then there's a lot that do, and you know, we're lucky to live in New York. And we are lucky to live in New York, but the politicians here do get it, right? So, you know, Bloomberg is not a perfect human being in any respect, but in terms of forward thinking on the climate issue, both resilience for the city and reducing the footprint of the city on the rest of the planet, they're doing a pretty good job, much better than, you know, parts of New Jersey. So. I think we have to kind of cut this down. But,
that's time.
Yeah.
Okay.
she was waving at me in a dramatic fashion. So.
Without warning, we're finished. But thank you all so much for coming, and tell your friends.
Yes.
Thank you, Gavin, so much.
Thank you for this opportunity.